Hello and welcome to week 7 here in Biopsychology, where we are going to be looking at the motor system, how we move around, how our muscles receive information from our brain in order to do the automated things that we have, but also the voluntary things that we have. And we'll talk about principally the motor pathway. Now, to begin with, we have to talk about that there are actually 3 kinds of muscle tissue because the way in which the brain interacts with those muscle tissues depends on the quality of those muscles and what they do. Now, the first one is the smooth muscle tissue, and this is part of our autonomic nervous system. Smooth muscle tissue is essentially the muscles that control our autonomic functions like breathing, digestion, peristalsis, the way food moves through our intestines and stuff like that. So those muscles are geared to be controlled by the lower aspects of our brain. A lot of stuff in our brainstem actually operates upon the smooth muscle system. The next one that we're most familiar with, when we see bodybuilders and when we're walking around and moving, is striated or skeletal muscle tissue. And this is the muscle tissue that's responsive to willful movement, but also to reactions like, say, reflexes and whatnot, which are interesting in terms of the psychology of those. Is voluntary movements and complex movements are organized within the brain and sent to the body, but lots of our reflexes and some of those, certainly a lot of the smooth muscle tissue signals actually come from the spinal cord without the involvement of the brain. So let's say your patellar reflex, that's the one on your knee, and you take the little hammer and your knee jerks a little bit. That signal goes from the knee to that point in your spinal cord that controls your leg, and then back to your leg. It doesn't go all the way up to the brain. That is processed at the spinal cord. So it's kind of one of the reasons why we refer to the spinal cord as part of the central nervous system as opposed to the peripheral nervous system. Now, what I'm going to do, the third muscle tissue, which is kind of a combination of both, and it's a very unique muscle tissue, and that is muscle tissue in our heart, the cardiac, the beating one. And years ago, I encountered a video. It was part of the Discovery series, and what it portrayed was petri dish grown muscle tissue. And the thing about it was that muscle tissue for the heart, cardiac muscle tissue, beats. It twitches on its own, even when it's not part of a heart. So it's not like there's a signal that's going beat, from the brain, although the brain's clearly involved. They beat on their own. And I have a little video. So let's take a look at my screen here. I prepared a little video. And this is homegrown muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue in a petri dish, beating all on its own. So, isn't that cool? They just kind of beat on their own, grown in a petri dish. So, I thought that was kind of cool. We'll cover that. Now, what I want to do now is kind of let's venture into the brain and develop an understanding of the motor pathway, but how information travels from the body to the brain and back again in order for us to experience movement. So I'm going to look at the graphic that we have here in the course book. And you see the visual pathway over here that I have also. We'll get to that in just a second. But first and foremost, what we see are these tracks down here, the dorsal lateral tract and the ventral medial tract. These are parts of the spinal cord areas of the spinal cord, which the dorsolateral tract is where information from the muscles experiencing resistance and from the somatosensory system are sent up that pathway in order to inform the brain where things are, what is happening out there that we might need to respond to. The ventromedial tract is the part that is sending information to the muscles and to the rest of the body. Now, up here is the primary motor cortex. And over here we have the primary sensory motor cortex. And the reason why I have my visual pathway here is from the other part of the textbook. Here we already discussed the what and where system of the visual pathway. So the ventral stream is the what are we looking at, and the dorsal stream is the where we are looking at. And look at that, how the dorsal stream sort of corresponds with this whole motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex. This makes perfect sense. We're moving through the environment. We're running along a jogging path, and there's a branch in front of us, and our visual pathway does the what and where, but the where is going to be important up in this area, because then the motor cortex can send the appropriate signal down the ventromedial pathway or the ventromedial tract in order for us to lift our right leg a little higher, jump over it, or to move to the right or move to the left in order to avoid the branch that's in front of us. So we see these systems coming together, this visual pathways, information from the body coming into that motor cortex area and sending information back to the body in response to our environment. So the actual area, it's not labeled on here, but the posterior area, meaning the back area of the primary cortex, interfaces with that where component from the primary somatosensory cortex. And then, so this is all kind of our body moving and whatnot, and we have a combination of voluntary and involuntary movements. Now, many of our reactions are very fast. They're still voluntary. I'm still moving to the right because there's a branch in the way, and we're jumping over it or whatever I'm doing, and those are all willful. But I want to focus a little bit. There's a part of the brain that kind of highlights the difference between, reflex type behaviors and willful behaviors, and that is the basal ganglia. And where that is, it's in the inner part of the brain. It's a shaded blue right there. Okay, it's like this bulbous sort of part inside of the brain. There's probably certainly better pictures than this one about it. What this does is it's an inhibitory. Its natural function is to inhibit or to stop movement. Now this is interesting because what it means is when the brain wants to do something, the frontal cortex, you want to write a word, or you want to type, or you want to reach for a can of SpaghettiOs, you send that information to your motor cortex. The automatic function of the basal ganglia is to inhibit that. Keeps you from doing it automatically. We're not automatically doing it. So the baseline of our movement is we're not doing anything. When the cerebral cortex, when our frontal cortex decides that we're going to do something, it sends that information to the motor cortex, but it also sends that information to the basal ganglia and tells the basal ganglia it's okay. We can do this, and the basal ganglia doesn't inhibit it anymore. So the disconnection of the inhibitor, so the thing that's stopping us from just moving around randomly, gets let go, and we're able to do willful things and reach our hand in a particular direction, again, using our visual system or internal representation if you're blind. So think of this as the standard way in which human beings move is rather, we've been moving all the time but the basal ganglia holds us back and so we have to overcome the basal ganglia's inhibiting properties in order to do willful movement, and that's the difference between willful and, let's say, the patellar reflex, which there's nothing that's going to stop that unless there's neurological damage. Okay, so just another cool thing about the brain. Now, the last part of the brain that I want to talk about here is the cerebellum, and this is part of the brain peculiarly placed. It's not up in the other part of the brain, but its function is coordination. Now, coordination, balance, understanding, of course, this is all integrated in the brain, the visual pathway and whatnot. You can see the cerebellum is right next to the visual cortex, getting information from there. It's right next to the brainstem, which is in touch with some very, very fast fibers for the kind of minute movement that we need to do when we're holding ourselves upright. We're constantly shifting tiny muscles in our body just to hold ourselves upright, as you know, so we can move about, let alone complex behaviors. And we can even put walking in there as a complex behavior, but consider dancing as a way in which we are constantly throwing ourselves off balance and catching ourselves in relation to gravity. Complex movements, and how we need to a system that will send information very quickly to muscles for these minute areas of coordination. So a really good dancer has a very, very developed system of coordination. So with practice, that becomes habitual, and that's why you see, let's say, professional athletes constantly taking free throws. You see people target practicing. Every time we practice something, we're developing that pathway, and the cerebellum becomes better and better at coordinating those minute movements, to the point that we can achieve what we might term as grace, or someone's graceful, the way they move. Every part of their body seems to be flowing in coordination with itself, and we see that in athletics, in dancing, people's just movement, the way some people carry themselves, and all that. These are practiced things, and so that's where the cerebellum comes in. Now, along with coordination, and we'll see this connection to the visual pathway, the cerebellum uses the ability, the visual information that allows us to track the motion of objects in our world, and that is the what's called ballistic eye movement, which is, let's say, you're tracking something flying across, you're looking at a bird, and it's that ability to track that bird going right across, that just as if we're moving in the environment, I'm able to track things that are moving in here, and the cerebellum is using that information to send signals. Go, here's a person coming closer. Do I approach? Do I go? And in order to make for a coordinated dance of some kind. However, it is also a part of the brain that is highly influenced by alcohol. And so here's what happens. When someone ingests a bunch of alcohol, it inhibits the cerebellum. And one of the ways in which it inhibits the cerebellum, obviously if people are too drunk, they walk wavily, right? Because their ability to coordinate ballistic movement is off, and they can't coordinate themselves in relation to objects around them or gravity, and therefore that's the effect of alcohol. Now the test for that has to do with a very simple test, has to do with ballistic eye movement, and you've probably seen or heard of police officers pulling people over, and they'll hold up their finger and they'll have you follow it. And what they're testing is ballistic eye movement. Now, a person who is inebriated, okay, will attempt to do that, but it will interfere, it's disrupted, their eye movements will become, they'll start non-ballistic movement, they'll start jumping, and they'll be able to see that in the eyes, and the individual also may become disoriented, and their relationship to the world is going to go, because they're trying to keep track of this thing, and they can't do it because it's being inhibited by the alcohol. So a very simple test to be able to to scan and follow a finger going across when a police officer is pulling you over. The other one is the individual can, you throw off the vestibular system by having the person lean back like this. So their body's upright, but their vestibular system is actually perpendicular, horizontal to the earth. And then again, coordinated movement. I put my hands out like this, and I try to touch my finger. And see, obviously I'm not inebriated while I'm doing this, so I'm able to touch my finger on my nose and coordinate that movement in space. An individual who has had sufficient amount of alcohol will find that very difficult. They might find just tipping their head back difficult. I've actually seen some videos, they tip their head back and they just kept right on going. And so these are very clear tests of a person who is experiencing some heavy alcohol use that test the cerebellum. They test the cerebellum. The cerebellum is off, then you're probably going to the pokey. So now that brings us to our assignments. So we have a discussion, and what I want you to do in this discussion is together, and it could be a quiz question. There's not a whole lot to discuss about it per se, but is to try and describe a very simple movement and how you would, let's say, teach a robot to do that. And I think of this a lot because I'm interested in artificial intelligence, but I'm also amazingly fascinated by the human brain and its complexity and the inability for us to create machines that can replicate it. So having a person in my life that I know who is into robotics, programming robotics and whatnot, we've had some casual discussions about it, and the amount of code that goes in to just the image that comes to my mind, because it was part of a discussion that I had with her, was emptying the dishwasher. Now I do the dishes, and when I'm picking up plates, I can stick my hand in and I can take a plate in each finger, and I'll do them that way. And I described doing that, and she said that would take an amazingly huge amount of code to do that, let alone coordinating the feel. I mean, not only am I just you could probably build a machine that will go like this and grab 4 plates, 3, but to actually kind of maneuver around and feel and whatnot. And if I feel a little spot on one, I know that's not clean. All of this information is being all coordinated as I'm picking up those plates. Just that tiny little thing is thousands of lines of code that would, in order to teach a robot that. But just kind of think of very simple things like picking up a quarter or something. If you're going to actually describe all of the motor movements that it would require, you're walking along, see a quarter, go down, pick it up. We say go down, and that's a million lines of code. Go down, pick it up, another million lines of code. That you would, as you're picking up, you would move your fingers slightly to grab the edges of it, maybe the kind of rough edge, otherwise it's going to slip out of your finger. How much pressure do you put on it? And if it starts to squeeze a little bit, and how you would release that. You don't want to squish it. You won't squish a quarter, but how much pressure do you hold on in order to lift it up to you? If, let's say, it's stuck in the mud, how much more pressure do you do? How much other pressure do you put on your arm in order to lift it? It's endless. It's endless, the amount of information that gets processed. Just kind of work through that in the discussion. And in the quiz, what I want you to look at is something that I skipped over. I forgot to mention it. And that is the relationship between aerobic and anaerobic muscle. Now, aerobic muscle tissue, when it's activated, uses up oxygen, but we're also breathing it in. And we exercise, when we're doing aerobic exercises, the muscles do not fatigue. Now, I've done aerobics. and I think they fatigue a lot. And but it's the anaerobic muscle action that fatigues because it uses up the energy stored in those cells. Research that. I want you to go out and research what is the relationship between aerobic and anaerobic muscle tissue and the experience of fatigue when we exercise. Okay, there will also be a lab. I'm going to do that in a separate video. We're going to be looking at, we're going to be squeezing a little bulb and measuring the electrical activity in our nervous system and the pressure that we exert on that bulb. It's like one of those balls for doing your blood pressure. So I'll be doing a separate video on that lab, and so you can look forward to that. And good luck with the discussions and the quiz.